a young German officer crouched inside a shattered farmhouse cellar near the Perrier-Saint-Lô road, pressing his hands over his ears as the earth itself seemed to come apart above him. And when the noise finally stopped and he crawled out into the daylight, he later said he no longer recognized the world he had been fighting in only hours before, because the hedgerows, the orchards, the stone farmhouses that had defined this corner of Normandy for centuries were simply gone, replaced by a gray, smoking, cratered wasteland that looked, in the words of the general commanding the division dug in beneath it, like the surface of the moon. And this was the moment when the war in Normandy, which had ground to a bloody stalemate in the Bocage country for nearly 7 weeks, finally broke open, not through some brilliant flanking maneuver or clever deception, but through the deliberate industrial application of concentrated air power against a single narrow strip of ground held by some of the most experienced soldiers in the German army, men who had fought in the deserts of North Africa and the plains of the Eastern Front, and who now found themselves buried alive under a bombardment so dense that nearly 3,000 tons of high explosive fell on an area barely 6 kilometers wide in the space of a single hour. And to understand how the Wehrmacht's carefully engineered defense of Normandy collapsed in that hour, we have to look at this battle not through American eyes, where it is remembered as Operation Cobra, the breakout that finally cracked the hedgerow deadlock, but through German eyes, through the eyes of the men who were dug into that ground, who had built their defense out of stone walls and sunken lanes and interlocking machine gun positions, and who now watched that entire system of engineering and doctrine get erased in an afternoon. And at the center of the story stands Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the Panzer Lehr Division, a unit that had been created specifically as a demonstration force built around instructors from Germany's Panzer training schools, men who were supposed to represent the very best of German armored doctrine, and who had been thrown into Normandy in June to plug gaps and counterattack the Allied beachhead. And by late July, after weeks of grinding attrition in the Bocage, Panzer Lehr was a shadow of the force it had been, its tank strength reduced from well over 100 vehicles to barely 30 operational panzers, its infantry worn down by constant artillery fire and the slow bleeding of small unit actions in terrain that favored the defender but also chewed up men and equipment at a punishing rate. And yet this weakened division was exactly the force that General Omar Bradley's First Army planners had identified as the key obstacle blocking the American breakout west of St. Lo, because Bayerlein's men held the critical stretch of the Perrier-Saint-Lô highway that American planners believed was the hinge of the entire German position in this sector. And so Bradley conceived a plan that had never really been tried in this form before, using heavy bombers, the 4-engine giants normally reserved for strategic missions deep into Germany, to blast a hole directly in front of advancing American infantry and armor, a tactic that carried enormous risk because bombing that close to friendly lines invited the possibility of hitting your own men. And indeed, on July 24th, in a preliminary strike that was supposed to be called off due to poor visibility, some bomber formations never got the recall message in time and dropped their loads short, killing and wounding American soldiers waiting in their jump-off positions, a tragic preview of what was coming the following day. And on the German side, this July 24th bombing created a strange and dangerous illusion, because when the bombing stopped after that first limited strike, some German commanders concluded the expected offensive had already happened and had failed, and they allowed themselves to believe the crisis had passed when in fact the real storm was still gathering. And On the morning of July 25th, it arrived in full force. Wave after wave of B-17s and B-24s from the American 8th Air Force, joined by medium bombers and fighter bombers from the 9th Air Force. More than 1,500 aircraft in total, flying parallel to the front this time to reduce the risk of another short bombing tragedy, though tragically another American general, Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, would be killed that day by bombs falling behind the intended line. A stark reminder that even with corrections, the margin for error in this kind of bombing remained razor thin. And for the German soldiers of Panzer Lehr crouched in their foxholes and dugouts along that stretch of highway, the experience defied anything in their training or their prior combat experience, because this was not artillery fire, which soldiers could often predict by sound and rhythm. This was an endless cascade of explosions falling in overlapping patterns across the entire depth of their position. Tank crews reported their vehicles being physically flipped over by blast waves. Telephone lines connecting forward positions to command posts were severed within minutes and never restored. Radio antennas were shredded. Runners sent to carry messages simply vanished into the smoke and dust. And entire companies that had been dug in along the roadside ceased to exist as organized units. Not necessarily because every soldier was killed, though casualties were severe, but because the command structure holding those soldiers together as a fighting force was obliterated. Men were buried alive in collapsed trenches. Disoriented survivors emerged from craters, unable to find their own units, and the carefully rehearsed German defensive doctrine, which depended on rapid communication between forward observers, artillery batteries, and reserve units ready to counterattack any breach, simply had nothing left to work with because the physical and human infrastructure of that doctrine had been pulverized, and Bayerlein himself, touring the wreckage of his division's position in the aftermath, described a landscape unrecognizable from the one his men had defended the day before. Farmland transformed into a field of overlapping craters, wrecked vehicles thrown at strange angles, and an eerie silence broken only by the moans of the wounded and the distant sound of American armor beginning to move. And it was this same Bayerlein who later summarized the devastation in a phrase that would become one of the most quoted lines to come out of the Normandy campaign, describing his own veteran division forged in North Africa and hardened through years of combat as having been effectively annihilated in that single bombardment. And while the exact wording of his post-war accounts has been retold in various forms over the decades, the substance of his testimony was consistent, that Panzer Lehr, once one of the most capable divisions in the German army, came out the other side of July 25th reduced to a fraction of its fighting strength, its tanks destroyed or buried, its infantry scattered, and its ability to function as a coordinated fighting force essentially gone. And this collapse could not have come at a worse moment for the German high command in Normandy, because the man responsible for holding this entire front, Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, was already operating under conditions of extraordinary strain, having only recently taken over as commander of Army Group B after Erwin Rommel was severely wounded in a strafing attack days earlier, and Kluge now found himself trying to manage a crumbling front while also laboring under a cloud of suspicion from Adolf Hitler's headquarters, because in the aftermath of the July 20th assassination plot against Hitler, which had occurred just 5 days before Cobra began, the entire German officer corps was under intense scrutiny, and Kluge, who had at least tangential contact with the conspirators and had been aware of the plot without fully committing to it, now had to prosecute a desperate defensive campaign while knowing that any perceived hesitation or failure could be interpreted at the highest levels not as a battlefield setback, but as evidence of disloyalty. And this psychological pressure compounded an already impossible tactical situation, because Kluge could see clearly that the German position in Normandy depended on holding a coherent line, but he had almost no operational reserves left to plug a hole of this magnitude. Most of the available panzer divisions were already committed against the British and Canadian forces around Caen, where Field Marshal Montgomery's operations, though costly and slower than hoped, had succeeded in fixing the bulk of German armor in the eastern sector. And so when the American VII Corps under Major General J. Lawton Collins began pushing through the gap torn open by the bombing, advancing behind Major General Leroy Watson's 3rd Armored Division and other spearhead units, there was simply no mobile reserve capable of sealing the breach. And this is where the deeper story of German military engineering, in the truest sense of that word, comes into focus. Because the Wehrmacht's engineer corps, the Pioniere, whose normal function was building bridges, clearing minefields, and constructing fortified positions, now found themselves facing an almost surreal task, attempting to reconstruct a defensive line out of ground that had been so thoroughly cratered and churned that the roads themselves had disappeared. Some stretches of highway were pockmarked with overlapping craters so dense that vehicles could not pass without extensive clearing work. And German engineer units that tried to move forward to establish new strong points found themselves working under constant harassment from Allied fighter bombers, the feared Jabos, which prowled the skies over Normandy and made daylight movement of any significant force a hazardous gamble. And this air superiority problem was not new to the Normandy campaign, but in the chaos following the Cobra bombing, it became decisive, because rebuilding a defensive line requires moving men, equipment, mines, and communication cable forward under some degree of cover, and with the skies utterly dominated by Allied aircraft, and with the ground itself resembling a lunar surface rather than passable terrain, the engineers tasked with knitting together a new front line were essentially being asked to perform an engineering miracle in real time while under fire, and they could not do it fast enough. Gaps that might have been closed within a day under normal circumstances remained open for 2 or 3 days, giving American armor and infantry the time they needed to widen the breach and begin the operational movement that would carry them south past Coutances and toward Avranches. And as the days after July 25th unfolded, the scale of the German crisis became unmistakable. Isolated German units, cut off from communication with higher headquarters and unaware of the true scope of the collapse, continued to fight with the kind of stubborn tactical skill that had characterized German infantry throughout the war. But tactical skill at the small unit level could not compensate for the absence of any coherent operational picture at division or corps level. Commanders literally did not know where their own units were, whether neighboring formations still existed as fighting forces, or where the American spearheads had actually reached. And this fog of war, always a factor in any battle, became almost total in the days following Cobra, because the physical means of gathering and transmitting information, the telephone wire, the radio set, the motorcycle courier, had been so thoroughly disrupted that command in the modern sense simply stopped functioning across large portions of the front. And by the time Kluge and his staff began to grasp the full extent of the disaster, American forces were already pouring through the gap in numbers that made any organized counterattack increasingly hopeless. And within days, this breakthrough would cascade into the wider collapse of the German position in Normandy, feeding directly into the encirclement battles around Falaise, weeks later, where entire German armies would be trapped and destroyed in a pocket that historians still regard as one of the most devastating defeats suffered by German ground forces in the West, and Kluge himself would not survive to see the full consequences unfold, because in mid-August, amid mounting suspicion from Hitler's headquarters regarding his conduct during this very crisis and his prior knowledge of the assassination plot, he would be relieved of command and would take his own life while traveling back toward Germany, a grim postscript to a battle he had never truly been given the resources to win. And what makes the story of Operation Cobra so revealing when told from this German vantage point is not simply that the Americans won a tactical victory, but that the entire German theory of defense in Normandy, built around fortified villages, interlocking fields of fire through the bocage, and rapid armored counterattacks to seal any penetration, depended on a level of communication, mobility, and reserve strength that had already been eroded by weeks of attritional fighting, and the Cobra bombing did not so much defeat that system in open battle as it simply removed the physical and organizational foundation the system needed to function at all. In a single afternoon, the ground was rearranged, the wires were cut, the command posts were destroyed, and the veteran soldiers who might have organized a fighting withdrawal were left disoriented and leaderless in a landscape none of them recognized. And this is why Bayerlein's image of the moonscape endures as such a powerful piece of testimony, not because it was poetic exaggeration, but because it captured something historically precise about what concentrated air power had done to the terrain and to the men defending it, transforming a battlefield shaped by centuries of Norman agriculture into something that looked and felt otherworldly, and reducing one of Germany's most storied divisions to a fraction of its former strength in the span of a single bombardment. And in the years since, historians have continued to debate the exact tonnage dropped, the precise casualty figures, and the degree to which Cobra represented a genuinely new template for close air support versus a costly experiment that succeeded partly through luck and partly through sheer overwhelming force. But what is not in dispute is the outcome that the German defensive line west of St. Lo, engineered with real skill and defended by real veterans, was broken open not by a battle of maneuver in the traditional sense, but by an act of concentrated destruction so total that it left the defenders no coherent structure to rally around. And in that sense, Operation Cobra stands as a grim illustration of a truth that would echo through the rest of the war in the West, that by the summer of 1944, Allied air power had become a force capable of reshaping the physical and human conditions of a battlefield before a single infantryman crossed the start line, and no amount of tactical skill or veteran experience on the German side could fully compensate for that reality. And when the smoke finally cleared over the ruined fields near St. Lo, the war in Normandy had changed for good. The static, bloody struggle in the hedgerows gave way to a war of movement that would carry American armor across France in a matter of weeks, and the men of Panzer Lehr, who had once been held up as a model of German armored professionalism, were left to reflect as survivors and as later witnesses to history on how quickly even the best engineered defense can be undone when the ground itself is taken away.